Candle Children by Michael Baker. A shibboleth in the form of a stolen story. A captain entered a woman's house. The terrified woman explained that she was a mother of two and begged to be spared. The captain made her an offer. Correctly guess which of his eyes was made of glass and he would spare her life. She instantly chose the correct eye. Amazed, he asked her how she could so easily tell. "Because," the woman replied, "that was the one that still had a glimmer of humanity in it." Chapter 1. It was as cold as the night Blue Jay had sold his soul to the devil in red. It had been midwinter when he sat and shivered in an alley for 2 hours while he tried to find the courage to light the votive candle. He'd been gripping an old cavalry pistol so tightly his hand had gone numb. He'd only had a single powder charge, and the lock was rusted almost to the point of uselessness, but it was better than nothing. In the end, he hadn't needed it. No one had spotted him, though afterwards he half wished they had. The Stone Queen, the patron spirit of destitute children, had not appeared. Instead, it had been the beautiful devil in red who had stepped out of the darkness and taken more than his soul. Now, blood was once again seeping between the flagstones of the closed aisle, and Blue Jay was shivering from more than the cold. Lysette and Jake deserved a better funeral. Their bodies had been wrapped up in a sheet hurriedly purchased off a rag-and-bone man and then dumped into the sea. It was almost insulting. They deserved so much more. The whole city should have turned out for their funeral. Their bodies should have been burned in the basilica itself, and afterwards they should have been made to be the subjects of grand statues and even grander speeches. Most of all, they deserved not to have died stopping a simple back-alley mugging. Instead, they got a midnight funeral attended by 7 of their fellow Candle Children, 3 members of the Wharf Wraiths who had witnessed their deaths but arrived too late to prevent them, and the boy they had saved, the boy who had gotten lost. There were people in the city of Rosetta who preyed on boys like him, people who could look friendly enough to convince a lost child that they really wanted to help him find his way back home. People who could make him forget all caution with their smiles as they led him into an alley. Then there were people like Lysette and Jake who had been scavenging in that particular alley, who had taken pity on the boy and stepped in to save a stranger for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. They had saved the boy. They had died doing it. And there was nothing Blue Jay or any of the Candle Children could do about it, except give them a pathetically inadequate funeral. They had done their best. They had placed coins for Nyx, the boatwoman, who would carry their souls to paradise in the palms and tied them with string. This meant they could pay Nyx for their passage before the ice claimed their souls and avoid the need for a church pyre. All the Candle Children, except for Blue Jay, had given a farewell speech. A few words or a mention of a happier time in most cases. Beth had simply muttered goodbye, while Silk, with one hand on the handle of the butcher's knife in his belt, had softly sworn a blood-filled revenge. Blue Jay sat on a small bench and watched as Silk and Dacid pushed the 2 bodies into the ocean. Part of him wanted to leap up and stop them. It was impossible that they were dead. It had to be some sort of trick. Only yesterday, Blue Jay had sat down with them to hash out the tune to a new song. They'd made little progress because Jake had fallen for a girl that he'd met the night before and wouldn't shut up about her, and tears stung the corner of Blue Jay's eyes. Jake had been happy and in love. Lysette had laughed at his earnest enthusiasm, and Blue Jay had continued to pluck the sad notes of the song, slipping them between Lysette's laughter like quiet footsteps. The Wharf Wraiths began to leave. They had a night of petty crimes to get to. They had attended the funeral out of respect because the murder had occurred on their territory, a fact that would result in a scuffle or two, perhaps even a few broken bones, until one way or another the street gangs would settle their little turf war. One by one, the Candle Children also left. Some said goodbye to Blue Jay first. Others just drifted into the darkness until only Blue Jay, Beth, the boy, and Dacid remained. "I'm sorry," the boy, who was called Thomas, said uselessly. Blue Jay had heard him say the words so many times that it had lost all meaning, but he still managed a nod of acknowledgement. "It wasn't your fault," Beth said, and Blue Jay felt the words tear open his stomach. It was. If Thomas hadn't gotten lost, if Thomas hadn't trusted 2 strangers, if Thomas had gone to Lysette and Jake's aid just as they had gone to his, then... No, Blue Jay thought. Beth was right. It wasn't the boy's fault. Blue Jay didn't understand how or why she was right, but as always, he had to put his faith in her. "We'd better get back home, Tom," Dacid said in a voice that was almost a whisper. Blue Jay watched as Thomas's eyes flickered towards Beth, and once again he felt hatred for the boy. He could read the look on Thomas's face as clear as day. The human boy did not want to walk the city alone with an orc blood. He wanted Beth to go with him. He was looking to a blind girl for protection from the big bad orc blood who struggled not to cry if he accidentally trod on a dog's paw. "If you say so," Thomas said. For once, Blue Jay was glad that Beth couldn't have seen the look of fear and distrust that so many of the humans had for orc bloods. She must have sensed something, though. Perhaps she heard the sudden intake of breath or a hint of fear in Thomas's voice. "I'll go with you both," Beth said, and Thomas didn't even bother to hide the rush of relief that lit up his face. It's always nice to meet new people. And it was easier for a blind human girl to claim a reward than a 6-foot orc blood. "You coming, Blue Jay?" Beth asked. Warily, Blue Jay stood, putting a slight more weight into his strikes of his staff. He walked over to her. He embraced her slowly, even though he was sure that she had heard him approach. Beth's cheek pressed against him, and for a few moments there was nothing but silence. He'd heard it said that he was the rock that supported Beth, but in truth, it was the other way around. She was a fire, and he drew upon that like a man close to death. "You coming with?" she asked again. He took her hand in his and drew a cross on her palm. "Okay, stay safe. The ice will be out soon." He didn't need the warning, but he suspected that the deaths of Lysette and Jake had put Beth on edge. The three said their goodbyes and left Blue Jay almost alone on the wharf. He sat back down on the bench and slipped his guitar from his back. He strummed a few notes of a new song while the figure, who had been standing a respectful distance away, approached. He was tall and rake-thin. Old, but still strong enough to stand up straight with eyes that shone like the moon. He walked to the edge of the wharf and didn't even turn to look at Blue Jay when he spoke. "You the leader of this little gang?" Only after a few seconds of silence did the man turn to look at him. Blue Jay shrugged. Beth was his leader. The man was well dressed in a black coat, white undershirt, and a black top hat, all things that spoke of someone who could attempt to look wealthy. It would fail. The clothes were covered in grime and almost as worn out as Blue Jay's. His eyes flicked to the red feather on the man's hat. "I'm Arthur Holenbrook," the man said. "You kids heard of me?" Blue Jay nodded. The old man was the leader of the Red Feathers, the gang responsible for Jake's and Lysette's murders. Blue Jay continued to play as the man spoke. "She was an orc blood, wasn't she?" He didn't bother to respond, hoping if he ignored the man he would eventually leave. Instead, Blue Jay focused on the music, that sad and lonely song that had been haunting his dreams for 3 weeks. "Shame about the lad. They say that he was thinking of joining the Wraiths. He'd have been a good fit." Blue Jay struggled on a few more bars. The memory of the song flickered out of his mind like a dying candle, and then the music stopped. Arthur didn't even seem to notice. "You should consider this a warning. If your kind get in our way again, we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks." Blue Jay looked up at Arthur and saw him glaring back with barely disguised contempt. He was aware that there were tears in his eyes again, and how much he was shaking. "Did you hear me? If an orc blood gets in our way, they are dead, and that goes for any human with them." Blue Jay began to play again. He wanted to disappear into the music, to pretend that he wasn't sitting alone at night with a man bloodthirsty enough to rise to the top of a street gang. Only slowly did he realize that the music had changed. His fingers had forgotten the slow, sad tune that he had played before. The new tune was full of fear and discord. He knew it well. It was called the Bone Stringers Concerto, and it was quite infamous throughout the city. The concerto had been written to be played on the piano, but Blue Jay had learned how to play it on the guitar after hearing it only once. Or so the story went, anyways. "Knock that off," Arthur said, and Blue Jay ignored him. "I don't believe in ghosts." Blue Jay almost believed him. The ghosts of Rosetta had learned long ago to stay away from anyone who could fight back. They went for those who lived on the very edges of society, people who wouldn't be believed or missed. Yet there was a tiny hint of fear in Arthur's voice. He couldn't be certain that all of the stories were made up. For a few seconds, they stared at each other until Arthur's lips twisted into a snarl and he lunged toward Blue Jay. One hand reached toward the guitar. The music stopped the moment Arthur's fingers touched the strange red wood. There was a moment of silence as the strings stilled themselves, and then Arthur screamed. The older man tried to wrench himself backwards. His hand didn't move, and the scream turned into a gargle. Blue Jay stared at the man's panic-stricken eyes for just a few moments before finally he slapped a hand onto the side of the guitar. Arthur, still trying to pull himself free, fell backwards and landed on the ground with a bone-crunching thud. Blue Jay wondered if he really thought that no one had tried to steal his guitar before. The Devil in Red took care of her investments. The strings of the guitar hummed a note until Blue Jay stilled them. She was angry. Arthur stared at his hand in horror. Even from several feet away, Blue Jay could see the blistering skin. She was very angry. Blue Jay put the guitar down and picked up his walking staff. He stood and gripped the staff tightly with one hand before reaching out to Arthur with the other. Arthur spat a curse at him, and then was on his feet, sprinting as fast as he could into the darkness. Blue Jay sighed and played the last of the few notes of the song. If he hadn't, then it would have attracted the attention of the bone stringer, and that was far too great a risk. The music had been little more than an empty threat. The Candle Children did not attract the attention of spirits, except in the most dire of circumstances. Aside from the empty threat, there was nothing Blue Jay could do about the murders. Going to the constabulary was out of the question. They were as much an enemy to the Candle Children as any other gang and twice as vicious. Every criminal in the city, from the pickpockets to the con artists, bribed the constabulary to survive. The Candle Children didn't rob, and so they never had the money to escape their attention. They couldn't fight back either. While other gangs tended to recruit only those strong enough to be useful, the Candle Children accepted anyone. In practice, that meant far more than half weren't even in their teens. Other gangs stuck together, carved out territory, while the Candle Children were scattered into small groups throughout the city. Most of the real gangs left them alone since they didn't steal and they weren't worth stealing from. No, they would not fight back. Much better, Blue Jay was sure, simply to endure and survive. Don't attract attention. Don't bring down the wrath of others onto you. Be small and unnoticed. That was enough to get through life. Blue Jay finished the song and then remembered Beth's warning. The ice would be creeping into the night air soon, and there was no holy candle in sight to shield him from it. Before he could leave, however, there was one thing he had left to do. Everyone had their favorite song. Over the next few days, each of the Candle Children would dedicate one performance of it to Jake and Lysette. No one was sure who had started that tradition. It might have even predated the Candle Children, but it was one that everyone followed. Blue Jay stopped before the last verse. Alone, out of all of the Candle Children, he didn't follow the tradition completely. He never finished their last performance. To do so would mean saying goodbye, and he couldn't do that. Not to Jake or Lysette or the dozen of others who had died over the past year alone. He sighed, slung the guitar across his back, and then packed up his staff. His need for it was a reminder of what the ice could do after just a few hours of exposure. The wharf was nestled between two of the smallest factories of the closed aisles. Smaller factories meant fewer watchmen and smaller bribes. It had cost him a bottle of whiskey and the most expensive part of the funeral. He walked slowly out into the dust street, giving a glance in all directions just in case Arthur had recovered his nerve. The streets were empty. The ice had once again driven everyone inside. There had been a time when that wouldn't be the case. Once the Church of She Who Burns had produced enough holy candles to illuminate every street with their blue glow. At almost 17, Blue Jay was just old enough to remember when there were enough candles for the main street of each aisle of the city. He could remember his mother taking him up to the wall of the Nobles' Aisle and looking out at the other 3 main islands. The holy candles had created faint blue lines that snaked through the islands like rivers of magic. These days, no one wasted holy candles like that. Not the church, not the nobility, not even the emperor. The church was producing fewer of them each year. That was not to say that the city was dark. Thousands of lights were shining like diamonds near the horizon. But the light was mundane, lacking anything close to the magical feeling he'd experienced looking down on them all those years ago. Blue Jay heard himself tapping a song with his staff as he walked. It was the same tune that he'd been plaguing him for 3 weeks. It was as if the song had a life of its own, and was doing all that it could to force its way into every waking moment. Not for the first time did Blue Jay wonder if the song came from the spirit. Not all songs did, of course, and not every spirit had a song. but the Candle Children's best songs always came from the spirit, usually via dreams. Beth had heard several belonging to the Stone Queen, and even one from Red Rosie, although they only played that song once a year to placate the spirit. Silk, whose talent at singing was far outweighed by her enthusiasm, had claimed to have heard the song from the three lovers. Even Dacid, who had only been part of the Candle Children for 6 months, had taught them all a song by the Devil in Red. That one had strung Blue Jay a little. If she was going to pick any of them, why not him? But he knew the answer. Although he could write, very few of the Candle Children could read. Spirits were an impertinent lot. They didn't want to wait around for weeks as Blue Jay tried to come up with increasingly bizarre ways to teach lyrics to people without speaking. Blue Jay at first assumed that the new song didn't have any lyrics, until he found himself catching snippets of them on the wind. He heard them buried in the buzz of daily life and in the city in quiet moments that sometimes settled over a crowd, between words screamed during an argument or a misheard musing from his companions. Yet he couldn't understand them. It was as if he was only hearing pieces of words, as if they had been broken down into millions of parts and scattered to the wind. He found Silk and others in the alleys off Spinner Street. They had used a large sheet to fashion a makeshift tent only high enough to crawl into. The material wasn't enough to keep out of the cold, but it meant that no one would be able to see the telltale blue glow from Blue Jay's holy candle. It had been some time since he had been attacked in the middle of the night for the light, but it was not an experience anyone would soon forget. When Blue Jay entered the tent, he saw that almost all of the children had wrapped themselves into tight bundles with whatever materials they could find. Silk had, not unexpectedly, found a bottle of some foul-smelling liquid. She offered him some, and Blue Jay shook his head. Silk shrugged and shuffled backward a little, making just enough room for Blue Jay to lie down next to her. Blue Jay covered his eyes for a moment. Now it was Silk's turn to shake her head. "Beth ain't back yet," she whispered. "I'd bet her and Dacid are spending the night with Tom and his family." Silk was older than the rest. When she first appeared on the streets of the Closed Isle, she'd said that she was 14-ish. 3 years later, she had advanced to 15, maybe 16, when drunk. It was, in Blue Jay's opinion, close to the truth. Silk drained the last of the bottle and pulled a blanket over herself. She lifted half of the blanket enough to cover Blue Jay. He lay down next to her and felt the blanket come down, an arm wrapped around his midsection. "Night, Jay," Silk whispered in his ear. He tapped her hand twice to acknowledge and tried not to wince at the sensation of her breath on the back of his neck. He was tired, and although there was always a measure of physical intimacy on the streets, Silk too often assumed that everyone was as comfortable with it as she was. It didn't take long for the others to fall asleep, but in Blue Jay's mind, the song still played. He thought he had most of the melody worked out. He ran through it again and again until sleep began to slow his thoughts. Then he heard the first word of the song, as clear as day and so loud that he first thought Silk was singing it. Then he realized why he hadn't understood the words before. They were in another language. He could see how the snippets of the words he'd been hearing fit together. He could place them in time with the melody. He had no idea what they meant, but he knew that they were in the right place. Blue Jay's mind was already slipping into darkness. In those last few moments, he found himself terrified that he would forget the breakthrough. What if he'd realized it before? What if he did so every night? His last thought was a second realization, coming to him thanks to a memory of his mother singing a similar song. That realization felt more important than the first, and he begged himself to remember it. It was the key to the whole song. The song was a lullaby.